But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to the History in Motion podcast. I'm Ritchie with our co-host Paul, and today we're diving deep into the aftermath of Julius Caesar's bold move that rewrote Rome's destiny. We're exploring the seismic shifts from the Civil War to Caesar's radical reforms and the dark turn towards dictatorship culminating in his dramatic assassination. After defying Rome by crossing the Rubicon, his strategic brilliance and ruthless ambition led him to dominate the Senate and his rivals, reshaping Rome with his sweeping reforms. From revolutionizing the calendar to expanding citizenship, his policies aimed to forge a new Rome, but also edge the Republic toward its demise. The climax of his saga, his assassination on the Ides of March, encapsulates the ultimate irony of power. His quest for absolute control ends in a betrayal that would seal the Republic's fate and pave the way for the empire. This episode isn't just about history, it's a thrilling exploration of ambition, power, and the fine line between genius and tyranny. Join us as we dissect Caesar's monumental legacy and the lessons it holds for the ages. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our series on Julius Caesar. And last time we spoke, we had seen Julius Caesar rise from being a young man through some political turmoil in Rome, all the way up to conquering all of Gaul and actually moving all the way into Britain and really establishing himself as this great Roman general. And it started to get some people worried. And we ended the episode off with the famous part of Caesar's life where he crosses the Rubicon, which we kind of defined as this point of no return where you make that decision, there's no going back. And, he famously said, the die is cast. So we've kind of got that set up. And now that the die is cast, we're going to start to focus on what comes next. And we all know how this story ends, but there's a lot of interesting things that happen and some interesting characters that come up. So I think it's going to be a pretty exciting end to this story, but it's the legacy, I think, is the most interesting part of all of this, because we all know the story, but there's just so much that comes out of this from additional history and something that even has an impact, in today's world, which is crazy to say for a story that's over 2,000 years old.
Yeah, I think it's the element of like this dramatization almost, as kind of like when you're doing research, there's almost this element of like theater and drama that kind of comes across, because like so many of these historical figures that we look at in this era, or like in the ancient era, it's really hard to believe that these things actually happened. One, because they're so far removed from us today, but just like the grand scale of what they're doing is just so difficult to wrap your head around. Like the episode with Alexander the Great, or even like part 1 of Julius Caesar, these massive campaigns, these kind of, cross-regional military battles that are happening. It's just fascinating. And I think, this episode is no different than, any of the other ones that we've done up to this point.
I think it's a great point just on kind of that trying to understand and wrap your head around it element, because you think too of how much time period we're really talking about here. The Roman Republic into the empire, at least the Western Empire, that's over 1,000 years. And if you think what's happened in the last 1,000 years, just in Europe, for example, there is way more history than we could even cover in this entire podcast if we kept doing it till the end of our lives. But to imagine, Rome for 1,000 years, and you see all these like great kind of moments, and then it kind of just steamrolls through all of these years. And you're right, it's so far removed, because you also have like different religions, countries that don't exist anymore, and customs that don't exist anymore. And so, yeah, it does almost have this like fantasy element to it, which I think provides that romantic element to it, which is, I think, why we all find this time period so fascinating.
I think that's such a great point. I think that's why we always go back to it, right? Like the amount of film, cinema, books, fantasy novels, to your point, right? That kind of like use this period as kind of the epicenter of it. It's kind of natural in a way. It almost like calls for it.
Definitely, yeah. And I think like you can even see a lot of fantasy novels, and even sci-fi, for example. You think about this time and kind of how the themes of, 2,000, 3,000 years ago haven't really gone away, but they make really good fiction. So I think maybe it's just kind of what we're consuming from a literature and cinema perspective, maybe that's where we're seeing a little bit of that connection, why we think, hey, this seems a little fantastical in a certain way.
Yeah, and I think this episode will be no less different, maybe even more so than the first one, because of the characters that we'll see on scene. Not to do too much foreshadowing, but we'll get there.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we were kind of chatting before about structure of this episode, and I think we should give a little bit of just a recap on how things went down last time, and then we'll get into right when Caesar crosses the Rubicon and descends onto Rome, and all madness ensues.
Yep. Perfect. We'll kick off with that. So in terms of part one, I will do a quick download of what we covered and then where we're going to be going in this episode. So starting off from the top, we have Julius Caesar. He is born into a patrician, but not so prosperous family. His tale does not necessarily begin with a silver spoon, but a lineage that's linked to the gods. His mother, Aurelia, is a matriarch of Stoic virtue, and his aunt Julia is tied to the legendary Marius, who were his anchors in Rome, who were kind of ripe with power plays and were able to influence society and those power networks around him, which really helped Julius Caesar out. From these matriarchal figures, he inherited not just patrician blood, but a connection to the very heart of Rome's populist strife. His early life took a dramatic turn when he was named Flamen Dialis, which tethered him to Jupiter's altar with privileges that were as much change as they were honor as the head priest. It was his marriage to Cornelia and his staunch refusal to cast her aside at Sulla's behest that marked him as a man of unbreakable will. If we kind of move forward, he's captured by pirates. He turns his captivity into a display of defiance. He promises his captors a higher reward than they're actually asking for, but he also seals their fate in the same breath, capturing them after he's let go and crucifying them after the fact. If we consider like the stage that happens afterwards, he's called back to Rome. He starts climbing the political ladder. He's a quaestor. He's in office. He has these continual triumphs as an aedile. He en masse continues to grow in popularity. He becomes Pontifex Maximus. He navigates the scandal of the Bona Dea with a tactician's grace, really proving his mettle not just on the battlefield, but in the very delicate arena of public opinion. And then with masterful genius, he is able to orchestrate the first triumvirate, which is this alliance between Pompey and Crassus. Each man is kind of a pillar in this structure that kind of vaults them above Rome's senatorial elite. And as consul, Caesar is able to wield his power to enact reforms. He champions the common man through reforms on land and debt relief, even as the Senate kind of sits there questioning his audacity to do so. Gaul, which was his empire in the making, really kind of serves as this backdrop or canvas for his military genius, and he continues to extend Rome's reach in his own legend. But with these triumphs, often comes some sort of discord. The triumvirate begins to fray, mainly by death and ambition, setting the stage for Caesar's boldest move. So I hope I've done, a decent job at recapping part one, because there was a lot of information there.
Yeah, there's a ton we talked about in a full episode and a ton we didn't even talk about. But I think that the main themes there is the fracturing, right? The Republic is really starting to break apart. There's been about a century of people pushing the line a little bit, and now Caesar is going to be that final nail in the coffin to really rip that Republic apart. He's now got all this success in Gaul, and now he has this army of not just loyal troops, but incredibly talented and skilled troops who are very, very experienced in warfare. So these are real veteran legions who, when you put them up against pretty much anybody in the world at this time, they're probably going to come out on top. And they also have Julius Caesar as their general, which obviously is a very helpful thing. And, Pompey is now at the point too where, Crassus has died in his Parthian campaigns, and Pompey now is gone against Caesar, and that triumvirate is really split apart, and they're ready for this clash, which again, like we've talked about a few times, there's some times where we see these battles. It's almost, I always say it's like the Super Bowl of battles, because you have two unbelievably talented generals on both sides. And if you look back at Rome's great generals, and you could probably put Pompey and Caesar, definitely Caesar's number one, but is Pompey top 3, top 4, top 5? Like, this is going to be a really, really big battle, and it's going to have two masterful generals. But the unfortunate part is they're both Roman, and right, this is the thing of
exactly
for Romans to fight against each other. It was almost unheard of, and if it did happen, it was like a point of huge shame for the Republic. But this is going to be not the first time it's happened, but the first, I guess, the beginning of this era where Roman soldiers fighting against other Roman soldiers in this battle for power. It's going to continue on till the end of the empire, and this is really the kickstart of that, two great men at the head of great armies who are loyal to them, not the state, and then one coming out on top and taking ultimate power.
Yeah, it's kind of, I think there's some early foreshadowing there, Paul, in terms of like the first time this is to happen where two Roman leaders of such great significance do battle. Ultimately, we know how Caesar's life ends between, his fate that ultimately comes with the Ides of March. But, you can see the kind of the cultural significance of a lot of these things. And, I think sometimes it requires some deeper analysis because it might not be so obvious about those cultural considerations that are, normal to Roman society at the time.
Yeah, and it's the whole reason this is happening, right? The societal norms are being broken down, and people who are a bit more conservative are not happy about it. But also the argument that Caesar and the more populace will make as well. Yes, these are these classic Roman traditions, but you've gone too far with those and you've consolidated your own power to a small handful of elite senatorial leaders. And what's left for the rest of us? And they're going to argue, well, this is the way it's always worked and we're more conservative. And unfortunately for the Romans, I would say, fortunately, we always talk about that military tradition being so important. This is sometimes when it backfires is, okay, I have all this success externally, but if I really want to gain power, I can turn it back internally. And I think that's probably a good segue point to talk about, Caesar's just about to cross the Rubicon and he's going to march on Rome, and things are going to change. So maybe, Richie, you want to take us through, he's crossed the Rubicon and what happens next, and what are people starting to talk about back in Rome?
Yeah, and I think this crossing of the Rubicon, right? Like, it's hard not to visualize this kind of epic event in history that's happening. So with just one legion at his command, he boldly defies the directives of the Roman Senate by crossing the Rubicon. It's essentially a very shallow river in northern Italy that marked the boundary of Rome's direct control. And I think, symbolically, this act he's not just merely crossing, the Rubicon, but it's a profound declaration of rebellion against the established order. The Rubicon bylaw was a frontier that no general could cross without explicit permission from the Senate. Doing so was considered an act of insurrection and a declaration of war against the Roman state. So I think, Paul, to your point, symbolically, pragmatically, this represents a, change of affairs. Julius Caesar has now declared war on Rome, and he is going with his legion to attack. And I think the Senate, as we'll see what happens with their fleeing, but this is his decision to cross the Rubicon. And it's essentially a culmination of a series of both political and personal rivalries that kind of simmered for years. The Senate, influenced by Caesar's political rivalry, Pompey the Great had ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. But why would he do that? He was obviously intelligent enough to realize that if he did do that, he'd be vulnerable to his enemies. He could potentially, and in my opinion, most likely be stripped of any immunity from prosecution and for any perceived or real transgressions during his tenure as governor in Gaul.
Yeah, I think what you kind of mentioned before about the Rubicon was like he's not messing around when it comes to, there's no misunderstanding here. He's doing it because it is a last resort and he needs to be very firm with his decision. There's kind of two ways he could have gone about it. Like if he hummed and hawed and thought about it, his soldiers may start to look at that as, you're Julius Caesar, you're the most decisive general that's maybe ever existed. It would be very out of character for him. So it is very fitting that he makes this very decisive and even romantic kind of grandiose decision that's very hard to say, like very hard line in the sand saying, I'm coming over this line and I'm not looking back. But then when you look at how the Senate is seeing him, Caesar has pushed the envelope a lot. He's done a lot of things that are illegal, maybe not technically legal, really pushing the boundary. And he knows that at some point he's been trying not to face trial because he's made enough political enemies that things are going to come bite him in the butt at some point. And now the chickens have come home to roost and he's being declared an enemy of the state and being asked to come back. So, you could say the Senate forced his hand a little bit. Maybe Caesar forced his own hand a little bit, but it doesn't take away from the point that I think just Rome is at such a turbulent time where we've seen all those buildups to an event like this happening. I don't think you can blame one or the other and say, oh, if Caesar didn't do this, if Pompey did this is just all of these things coming together, and it wasn't going to end well for somebody, but Caesar's like, hey, I'm going to take fate into my own hands, and hey, if it works out, it works out, and if it doesn't, that was pretty much the alternative anyways, so we'll see what happens.
I think that's a perfect segue to where we had left off in part 1 of the episode, where he utters his famous phrase, the die is cast. And essentially, to your point, like, this really does signify a point of no return, right? It's the sayings kind of become emblematic of moments of irrevocable decision and change. So, he's crossing the Rubicon. He's not only challenging the Senate's authority, but he's also signaling a monumental shift in Roman politics and governance. Essentially, he's igniting a civil war that would ultimately lead to the end of the Roman Republic. So if we kind of fast forward a little bit, we take it from a different perspective. So following his move to cross the Rubicon, Pompey the Great, along with many of Rome's senatorial elite, made the strategic decision to flee Greece. So obviously this decision could not have been taken lightly. It was a testament, to the stark realization within the immediate vicinity of Rome that they could not muster the forces sufficient enough to challenge Caesar's advance.
It's very un-Roman too, right? We're going to leave our city wide open to this enemy of the state and not just escape to like southern Italy or something. Like, we're going to go across the Adriatic and we're going to go to Greece and we're going to try to figure things out there. And so it's a smart decision because, again, we know Pompey, he knows warfare very well, and he knows the formidable force that Caesar has with him. And, to win in a pitched battle, the way things are sitting right now, it's not going to end well. And, Caesar's done some work as well to kind of bring more people to his side and kind of sow some of the seeds of doubt within some of Pompey's supporters. But at the end of the day, though, the Senate and Pompey still have the ideals of the Roman Republic behind them. So for them, I see it almost as a move of, okay, can we buy some time? Can we try to get some propaganda out there against Caesar to say, hey, this is an enemy of Rome. He's a madman. He's trying to declare himself king. Maybe we can get some of his people to defect. Maybe we can bring some more people along to our side. So I think it's a good long-term decision, a wiser decision. But again, the optics of it, imagine just being someone in the city of Rome saying like, wait,
you nailed it.
Pompey's going, the senators are going. What the heck is going on? This is very unlike Rome.
I think you nailed it. And I think that's kind of where some of my analysis took me. And I think you brought it up a little bit earlier. But essentially, Pompey is no ordinary general. He's one of Rome's most celebrated military leaders whose achievements in command had once earned him the title of Magnus, or the Great. So, optics, like the decision to retreat, I wonder how much that influenced or what that meant to the Republic as a whole in terms of the general populace. In one respect, it's probably a profound indicator of Caesar's strength and the loyalty he commanded from his legion. Might have also highlighted the Senate's vulnerability and its reliance on Pompey's military prowess to uphold its authority against Caesar's challenge. But his march on Rome, following his unopposed crossing of the Rubicon, is also kind of a triumph in its own right. And it's not marked by the usual fanfare of Roman triumph, but rather by the absence of resistance. Kind of this like I would call it a silent testament to his unparalleled position in the Roman world at this time. And Rome, being the heart of the Republic, kind of lay open and undefended before him. Kind of a clear sign that the balance of power is shifting, quite significantly.
Yeah, I like the point you made about like that's almost like the ultimate sign of respect. You've just vacated the crown jewel of your Republic, the crown jewel of the world, probably according to Romans, the greatest city the world's ever seen, to this general and to his army, because you have so much fear that he's just going to steamroll your army and take what he wants anyways, that you're willing to give all of this up to kind of think maybe longer term. It's probably the right strategic decision, but you're right. Like, there is probably a second level to this where people are starting to look at Caesar going like, if Pompey's leaving and not sitting to fight him, what does this mean about this guy? Maybe there's something more to him that we're not fully seeing here. And maybe that's going to win him some more supporters, at least in the short term.
Yeah, 100%. I think, analysis is always what you make it. You could read into things too much. You can read into them not enough. And I think, especially in this move, I think we're reading into it correctly. If they're fleeing from an optics perspective, I'm sure as an average citizen, you would really question the strength and, power of what the senatorial elite and Pompey are thinking right now. But, that's all inference from our part. But I don't think we're reaching with that analysis.
I don't think so at all. Like, in my head, I'm like, what if there was a rebellion army in the United States and Joe Biden took a bunch of senators and congressmen and women with him and went to I don't know, Mexico or Canada and waited it out to try to come back. You can only imagine what, the news channels would be saying today about, this act of cowardness and that kind of stuff, even if it was the correct strategic decision. So I can only imagine what, the average Roman citizen was thinking about it.
Yeah, I think it's such a fascinating reality, and like the symbolism behind it really kind of, I think it really allows you to unpack what's happening and kind of the status quo changing. So if we move forward with Pompey's decision to flee to Rome, kind of driven by these multiple factors that we've already touched on, it's the need to buy time to muster and consolidate forces from the eastern provinces where he had significant support and resources. He and the Senate retreated to southeast Italy at the time and then sailed to present-day Albania and Greece in the early months of 49 BC. This move effectively abandoned Italy to Caesar, who then rapidly secured control of Rome and the Italian peninsula. However, Pompey's strategy was to leverage his control over the eastern territories of the Republic, gather forces, and then prepare for a decisive confrontation with Caesar.
Another thing to mention too is the senators who are very rich at this point, who Caesar is accusing of being these oligarchs, they have significant land holdings in Campania, which is like where Napoli is today, so a little bit south of Rome. Mm-hmm. And so to just abandon not just Rome, the symbolic heart, but to abandon the land that's making all these senators very, very rich, it really tells you how serious of a situation this is, because for some of these guys, all they care about is their money and their power. They don't necessarily care as much for the ideals. Some do, some don't. But to just abandon everything, it just really shows the level and gravity of the situation that's at hand.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, if we gloss over these things, I think it undermines the actual importance of what's happening, right? We could talk about the senatorial elite just fleeing, but the fact that we can call out the exact area that they're fleeing and the significance it has to them, I think really underpins the degree and severity of what's happening right now in the Republic.
We reiterate a lot of these things because, you could easily have just said, so Pompey and the senators left and then Caesar followed them and there was a battle, right? But you really need to understand the gravity of what's happening now, because I think the more interesting part of this is understanding this mentality shift that's happening. Oh my goodness, what is going on right now versus, a campaign into Gaul is a little bit more standard day to day for Rome. It's a great victory and hey, we've defeated the Gauls. That's amazing. But it's part of the plan, right? It's, a Roman army going and conquering some barbarians. That's how things are supposed to work if you're, looking at it from a Roman's perspective. But for that general to win and then turn around and chase the Senate out of town, that's not how things have worked. And they really nothing like that has happened up to this point. So this is just completely like out of the box thinking and something completely different that there's really no playbook for. So what happens next is as good as anybody's guess.
It really is like this kind of watershed moment, right? And I think that's what we'll kind of continue to see in this kind of epic saga. But so once they flee, there's some subsequent military campaigns that saw Caesar kind of pursuing Pompey across the Balkans and into Greece. This culminated at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. So despite his initial strategic withdrawal from Pompey, and he was able to actually gather a sizable force, he was still decisively defeated. And this defeat forced him to flee the battlefield, ultimately seeking refuge in Italy, where we'll see he meets his tragic end. And what we're seeing is, Pompey's flight from Rome set in motion a series of events that really would ultimately reshape the Roman Republic. And I think his flight from Greece to set the stage for the next phase of the Civil War, moving the conflict from the Italian peninsula to the broader arena of the Eastern Mediterranean with its, resources and strategic location, offered Pompey that base from which he could regroup, gather forces, mount a counteroffensive against Caesar. He was able to kind of meet some of those goals and objectives that he thought that would allow him to confront and do battle with Caesar in a meaningful way. And I assume he thought he would, have a better chance at kind of overthrowing him and being able to go back to Rome. But that definitely was not the case.
And it's the thing with civil wars, right? It's all about how much power you can gain from these strategic alliances throughout, not just within your empire, within your republic, but within your client states and within neutral parties as well. And so I think you said Pompey flees, is it to Egypt? He flees after Greece? So he flees to Egypt, which it's not a Roman province at this time. It's friendly with Rome, but again, the people in charge are going to have to now make a decision. Do we actually ally with Pompey? Do we actually, or this Julius Caesar guy, if we maybe ally with him, maybe there's something we can gain from this that's a little bit more than just seeing what happens from this battle. You want to be on the right side of this civil war, especially a Roman civil war at the height of the Roman Republic. You want to be on that right side of that. So as you were saying, we can see what Pompey's strategy is, but after you lose a battle, kind of licking your wounds and trying to recover and trying to get that army back and trying to gain more allies gets a little bit harder with every little battle that you lose. And eventually it's going to catch up with you where someone's going to look at you and go, you know what? I think I'm going to ally with the other guy, and we'll see what happens with Pompey. But yeah, it's just taking it down that road of who can you really trust and who's going to be on my side, and do I have the resources to even try this again? So we'll see what happens. But I think that's kind of the way to look at it, is you're always trying to gain favor. You're always trying to get finances and all of these things to kind of have another shot at, bringing the Civil War to an end on, your own terms.
Yeah. And I think we'll see a lot of those themes kind of emerge in the second half of this episode, which is the complexities of building these alliances in this particular point in history. But the fate of Pompey in Egypt in 48 BC is probably one of the more dramatic things we've probably talked about on this podcast.
Yeah. Maybe before we get into it, Ritchie, should I give a quick just overview of what's going on in Egypt, maybe before we get into it, because I think it'll be good for when we hear about his fate, why it kind of makes sense. So Egypt at this point is, and if you listen to our Alexander the Great episode, is not the land of the pharaohs in the, more traditional ancient Egyptian sense. There are still pharaohs, but they're descendants of Ptolemy, who was a general of Alexander's. And so now you have this Ptolemaic dynasty, they're calling it. And at this point, there's actually a civil war that's kind of, I wouldn't say a civil war, but some civil conflict that's kind of going on within Egypt. So you have Ptolemy the 13th and Cleopatra the 7th are actually co-rulers, and they're siblings and they're co-rulers. Cleopatra is the Cleopatra that we all know from all the movies and things that have been created throughout, the history of cinema and literature, and all, the star of some of Shakespeare's work and those sort of things. But what's kind of happening is there's this sibling rivalry in Egypt, and there's the Ptolemaic side and the side that's kind of allied with Cleopatra. And Cleopatra's actually been exiled from Alexandria. Ptolemy's advisors are kind of taking control over the city. And so there's just a lot of other strife going on. So you have some agricultural issues that are going on because, Egypt is really big on their agriculture because they have the Nile River, which is one of the most fertile lands in all of the Mediterranean. So there's that. Plus, additionally, there's these Greek ruling elite that kind of live separately from the native Egyptian population. So there's starting to be tension between the groups, and you just have a really fractured society at this point. But the key thing is you have these two rulers, Ptolemy and Cleopatra, who are now fighting each other, but kind of allying themselves in different areas. And so their fates are not settled at all. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. But now Rome is going through a civil war. Pompey is actually, the great Pompey has arrived in Egypt. Julius Caesar is hot on their tails. If I'm Cleopatra or Ptolemy, I need to be on the right side of this civil war because they know at some point that Rome's going to be on their doorstep. And if they make the right decision at this point and ally with the right side of the civil war, they're going to win their own civil war or their own civil strife and then be able to kind of consolidate their power. So both of them are kind of thinking that, and especially the people around Ptolemy and Cleopatra. So when Pompey arrives with all that context, they got to make a decision. Is this a friend? Is this a foe? Is it something else? And that's kind of where the fate of Pompey comes in and how things get very, very interesting, with this whole Egyptian side of this story.
I think that's such a great job, Paul, just providing that backdrop, because I think there is this kind of insular complexity that we need to be aware of when we're talking about Egypt and the different political alliances and, the political subtext that we're kind of grazing over, but it's very important to the narrative as a whole. So he arrives on the shores of Alexandria, and his fate takes another tragic turn. The advisors of the young pharaoh, to your point, Paul, they're trying to calculate the political win, and they come to the conclusion that they want to curry favor with Caesar, and they make the decision to assassinate Pompey. Before Caesar's arrival, Pompey is lured onto a small boat under the guise of a welcoming party and is brutally murdered by soldiers of Ptolemy the 13th. His head is severed and preserved to be presented to Caesar as a gift, while his body was unceremoniously disposed of.
It's just this awful, awful ending for what, quite frankly, is a great man who is on the other side of this civil war, but has done so much for Rome. And where you can tell these stories are real is because if this was some sort of fantasy or mythological story, Pompey would have died in a great battle, fight to the end, back against the wall. But in this case, he's just getting stabbed on his ship when he had his back turned, which is the way most of these guys end up going out when they've, crossed the wrong people. So yeah, it's, I think, the one really human element that we see to all of this. And it kind of just it sucks for the story because it's, you want that fantasy kind of fantastical ending, but at the same time, it adds this really interesting wrinkling to how the heck is Caesar going to respond to this? Because is he going to be like, thank you so much, you've taken out my enemy, now I can wrap this war up and go back to Rome? Or is he going to take it a little bit differently? And I think from what we've seen with Caesar, right, he's not one for having things done simply or without some sort of honor in his kind of eyes. So yeah, it's an interesting, I think, next step to see what Caesar does when he gets that head in a box.
Yeah, and I think you get to see some of that complexity of Caesar. So when he arrives in Egypt, he's presented with Pompey's severed head, and obviously to the contrary to the expectation of Ptolemy's court, Caesar's not very pleased. In fact, he's pretty visibly appalled and saddened by the sight. Pompey, despite being his enemy in the Civil War, he was once a friend, a son-in-law, and a fellow consul. And Caesar's reaction to Pompey's gruesome end is multifaceted. It's a mix of personal loss. There's still an element of political calculation, and it's a demonstration of his own clemency and moral superiority. I think it marks a couple of different moments in Roman history. Like, obviously, it signified the end of Pompey the Great, who is this towering figure in Roman politics. His career spanned, I think it's the Sertorian War through the era of the First Triumvirate to his final role as the champion of the senatorial cause against Caesar. And his death kind of symbolizes the definitive closure of one chapter in Roman history. And secondly, I think, the manner of his demise and Caesar's reaction to it really underscores the brutal and unpredictable nature of political alliances and in the ancient world. It's demonstrated the dangers of seeking refuge and the fickleness of international support at this point in time.
Yeah, it's this, like we were kind of praising Pompey before, right? We're like, he's doing a great move here. He's going to Greece. He's trying to gain allies. Now he's trying to do the same thing in Egypt. But all it takes is one person in that room to say, you know what, I think I'm going to make a change here, and I'm not going to give him what he needs, and I'm going to try to use this to gain favor. But also thinking from Caesar's perspective, he's obviously clearly sad due to it being a friend. It's also I would say enemy, but external country or province, or whatever you want to call it, murdering not only a Roman, but like a great Roman, person revered by the country. I don't care who you are. You don't mess with somebody like that, especially when Caesar's hot on your heels. And there's even some discussion around what Caesar would have done when he finally captured Pompey. Probably what would have happened is, Pompey would have committed suicide and he would have been given, more of an honorable death and burial in Rome. But there's even talk of, and this might be I'm sure this was some Caesar propaganda, but there's rumors that he kind of had plans to, give Pompey some clemency and bring him back to Rome, and maybe not necessarily put him in a position of power, but allow him to live a life where he's still able to contribute to society, with the understanding that, Caesar's the boss now and he's in charge, but still give him the respect that he deserves kind of in his later age. And so outside of, Pompey dying on the battlefield, which I'm sure Caesar thought is like the worst scenario that could have happened, to find his head in a box from this welcoming party, I think was probably the last thing that he had on his mind. And I would have loved to see kind of his face, because it would be this mix of shock, anger, but just deep sadness for, this whole situation.
Yeah, I think it is very multifaceted, right? In one respect, I can imagine the Egyptians kind of being like, oh, you're not happy. You've only been chasing this guy across the Mediterranean, right? But in the same respect, I think there is that like code of honor and, respect for like those cultural and social norms of the Republic. To be greeted with his head is probably not what he expected at all. But not only is it not what he has expected, but, he's now entangled with this kind of internal conflict between this eternal Egyptian dynastic conflict between Cleopatra and Ptolemy. And, this is probably like a powder keg now at this point in time that he finds himself situated in, which he probably didn't expect.
Yeah, because I bet you the followers of Ptolemy are like, great, we've killed Pompey. Caesar's going to be our buddy. He's going to help us kick Cleopatra's butt, and we're going to have this great alliance with Rome, and we're going to do great things. But of course, with Caesar, nothing's ever that simple. But at the same time, like, to see his reaction to, okay, well, first impressions, you only make one of them, and we've killed his old friend and given his head in a box. Yeah. I don't really know how this is going to go down. So it's already a bit, like you said, a bit of a powder keg. And now you've brought in, I don't even know, you've lit this match by giving it to Caesar, but then he's also his own powder keg in his own sense, because he's got this massive army behind him and he's this great general and his ambition does not stop at anything. What the heck is going to happen next? Because theoretically this should bring peace and everybody goes home and it's, the war is over. But nothing's that straightforward with Caesar.
Yeah, and I think like against all the backdrop against all of this is essentially what we're seeing in Rome is a transition from like the Republic to the imperial system under Caesar's adopted heir Augustus. So, you have this tragedy of Pompey's end in Egypt. Obviously it's resonating throughout history, not just the fall of this Roman titan, but it encapsulates kind of this one complexity, second, the brutality, and this massive transition that just happened in the ancient world, all kind of encompassed in this series of events.
Yeah, it's just going to change. It's setting the seeds for things to change. And you're right. Like, we have young Octavian who becomes Augustus, is starting to maneuver politically within Rome. And, Caesar's now seeing Egypt as, it was the breadbasket of Rome for a very, very long time. And seeing the influence and power that this turbulent state has, again, the ambition of Romans and the ambition of this transformation and all this opportunity that is coming. There's a lot that's going to change in the next decade, but there's going to be a lot of blood and a lot of death and a lot of unfortunate times for a lot of regular people, but we'll see how things come out of it. But you're right. This is just a big, big change, and it had been coming for a while, but it's interesting as we get through the next few episodes, as we continue the stories, how quickly we've gone from this pseudo republic era to tried and true imperial system with an emperor and supreme power, and what Rome's going to look like for the next few centuries.
Yeah, and I think now you start to see the entanglement too of two civilizations, right? We're going to touch on the Alexandrian War, but his encounter with Cleopatra, like this is something made for them. And I know we keep going back to this kind of theme, but it truly is that. So against this backdrop, you have Julius Caesar's subsequent encounter with Cleopatra. It's probably one of the most fascinating episodes, not just of his life, but I'd probably say like of ancient history and history more generally, because you have these two iconic figures now who become entangled with their own political blending of their own political spheres of military conquest, political strategy, and personal drama.
Yeah, like you have a little bit of that personal drama, adds a little bit of flavor to it because it just makes it more interesting, right? Especially we have a bit of a love story as well that's coming here soon. So yeah, I like kind of how it has all of that. So I guess now what happens, Ritchie, right? Like Caesar's very obviously furious with everything that's happened. The Ptolemies are like, uh-oh, what did we just do? And Cleopatra's maybe looking at this from the outside going, maybe there's an opportunity for me here because he's clearly not happy with the supporters of my brother. So yeah, what kind of happens next year with Caesar and this whole Egyptian powder keg?
So I think there's a couple of things. So yeah, I think one, we've kind of hammered it home, which is that he's not happy with how the pharaoh has dealt with Pompey and, severing of his head, presenting it as a gift did not go as expected. And Caesar kind of sees this as a very dishonorable killing of his rival, but former son-in-law, friend. And instead of aligning with Ptolemy, Caesar actually takes up residence in Alexandria and demands that Egypt start paying back debts that are owed to Rome. And Caesar's presence in Alexandria, along with his demands and his taking of the royal family members as hostage, which he does, led to escalating tensions between him and Ptolemy the 13th's forces. This situation quickly deteriorates into an open conflict, leading to the siege of Alexandria, where Caesar found himself, significantly outnumbered, trapped in a part of the city with very small forces of legionnaires. But despite being cut off from reinforcements and supplies, he manages to hold his ground. He employs his tactical acumen to fortify his position. He maintains morale amongst his troops, and the siege sees these kind of several dramatic moments, including Caesar's burning of his own ships to prevent them from falling into enemy hands, a fire that reportedly spread to that part of the city and possibly damaged the famous Library of Alexandria, although, historical accounts do vary. And then when we kind of layer this in, where's Cleopatra in all of this? So in a very important subplot during the siege was the rivalry, as we've talked about, between Ptolemy the 13th and his sister Cleopatra the 8th for the Egyptian throne. So Cleopatra, being very opportunistic, strategically, inclined, is wanting to seek an allyship with Caesar against her brother, and she is famously had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarter, rolled into a carpet, and Caesar and Cleopatra, as the story goes, became lovers, and their alliance significantly shifted the balance of power in the siege. So with Caesar's report, Cleopatra aimed to solidify her claim to the throne.
It almost sounds like a cartoon, like someone wrapped up in like a big carpet, right? I always love that story because it, you see it in like kids shows and stuff, like, almost like
exactly
something a bit silly. But what a move by Cleopatra though, right? To Not only does she understand that she needs to gain some allies if she's going to win this war, she recognizes Caesar's ability, but she goes to Caesar when he's in a really tough spot. This isn't Caesar triumphant after a massive victory. He's on his heels here, and there's a real chance that he might get killed in this situation because he is significantly outnumbered. And we've always said it, like, fortune favors the bold, right? And so by backing the right man here, she's able to, come out on top in this. And we'll touch on Cleopatra next week because her story is very, very fascinating. But this is what happens with civil wars. You have to make these bets and you have to try to be on the right side of them. And for Cleopatra, it ends up being the right decision. But again, by going at it when he's not at a good spot and he's really got his back against the wall, you're going to gain so much respect from Caesar. And probably part of the relationship builds on that too, where he knows that she's coming to him not as this, I see you as this great leader who's got all of this power and I want a part of it, of, hey, you're not in a good spot. I'm not in a great spot. Let's work together and build something out of this. And so I feel like for Caesar, he's definitely having a lot more respect in that sense. And like I said, you can see why that relationship flourished, not just from a political relationship, but to like a romantic relationship and even more than that.
Yeah, I think it's a relationship of mutual benefit, right? This alliance, it marks a turning point not only in the conflict but in their personal lives. Cleopatra seeking to reclaim her throne, she allies herself with Caesar, and she needed his military support to secure her rule over Egypt, while Caesar required the resources and the strategic advantages that Egypt offered to consolidate his own power in the Roman world. But the relationship's also marked by this kind of personal intrigue. For Caesar, the alliance with Cleopatra was a very pragmatic decision. It gave him influence in that key region, and it gave Cleopatra an opportunity to secure her throne. But there is also this whole narrative of them becoming lovers, this union between Caesar and Cleopatra. They actually bore a son known as Caesarion, and this child adds this very deep personal dimension to his political maneuvers in Egypt and his legacy. While Caesar never actually officially acknowledged Caesarion as his heir, the boy's existence represented this kind of tangible link between Rome and Egypt, two of the ancient world's greatest powers at this point.
It's crazy to think too, right? Like you said, these two powers coming together, and you have this child who's the son of the two great powers in the Mediterranean. It is very interesting. And I'm not sure what his fate ends up being, but there is an element to say you're Cleopatra and Caesar's son. The pull that could have. And I'm sure the amount of people that try to use that as a springboard to gaining power would be really, really fascinating to see. So yeah, because I don't know much about what happens to him, but that's just another wrinkling to this whole story.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I think it's really hard to even wrap your head around considering how he ended up in Egypt and kind of the backdrop of how it all kind of came to be, to end up having this not only strategic and political alliance, but then to actually become lovers and bear a child that you two had together across these two powerhouses in the ancient world. Like it is actually so incredible, and it's such a great story, I think, like for historians like us to be able to chat about, because I think it really does provide a very interesting personal element. We can talk about political alliance, strategic necessity, military tactics, but I don't think we've talked about two powerhouses having a kid before that kind of link the ancient world together from these two respective sources of power.
Yeah, and so I just looked up real quick what happened to him, and in my head I was like, there's no way Octavian/Augustus allowed him to live after he won, and that's precisely what happened after he won his civil war. Caesarion was promptly executed based on the fact that you can't have Caesar's son running around claiming that he's the rightful heir to, Rome when there's this power vacuum that needs to be created. So yeah, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in a later episode, but just, yeah, another wrinkling to this story.
Yeah. And I think, for the sake of time, and we, again, to your point, Paul, we could probably have 1,000 podcast episodes on just Julius Caesar's life because it's so fascinating, but we'll fast forward a bit to his return to Rome and some of the political reforms that he kind of implements. So we're really talking here about the period of 46 and 44 BC.
So I think one thing to mention before we get there is what the heck has been happening in Rome this whole time while he's been gone? And there's quick thing that we need to bring up, because Caesar's going to come back and people are going to be very, very happy to see him. And whether this was a political move by Caesar or just the way it worked in his favor. And the reason for that is Mark Antony has been in charge. So Mark Antony has been the number 2 for Caesar throughout most of his campaigns. He's an excellent soldier. The common soldiers love him. He is really well respected by Caesar on the battlefield, and he's someone he can trust. So he puts Mark Antony in charge of kind of a co-consul type of role to kind of keep an eye on the city and make sure someone's running the city while he's off on campaign. But Mark Antony stinks at administrating. He's pretty lazy. He wants to just take it easy. He's not really interested in governing. And there's a lot of civil unrest that kind of happens while Mark Antony's in charge. So really when Caesar returns, everyone's like, oh, thank goodness you're back. This guy you left in charge really doesn't know what he's doing. And so this is just another thing that's going to help Caesar, the populace, come back and say, okay, I'm here, guys. I'm not going to overthrow Antony, but he knows I'm in charge, so I'm going to step in and take over and, right this ship a little bit. So it's just an important piece to add, because he's not just walking back into a city where everything's been going really well and, oh, why are you here again? You've been gone for so long. Like, no, thank goodness you're back. Things weren't so good for a while while you were gone.
I think that's great context. It's like he's coming back to a republic that is in need of reform, right? Like they're likely welcoming him with open arms.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like we were talking about earlier. Things are changing so fast. You need these reforms and you need a strong, stable government. And Mark Antony's the last person that's going to provide that. So thankfully for the Roman citizens, Caesar's back to clean up the mess that he left with Mark Antony.
I think that's a great segue. So he essentially comes back, and with his characteristic blend of like vision and pragmatism, he embarks on a series of ambitious reforms designed to, one, stabilize the government or the state, improve the lives of its citizens, and solidify his control over how Rome is governed. One of his most enduring reforms was the introduction of the Julian calendar. I thought this was interesting. So, as we know, an initiative that corrected the inaccuracies of the previous system, which remains the basis of the calendar we use today. This reform, I think it really does symbolize his approach. It's practical, it's innovative, and it kind of eyes both an immediate need and future legacy. I think he kind of nailed it with that one.
For sure. And then he named July after himself. So what more could you like about that? And one small thing I read about the calendar was, I think they added leap years for the first time, but they did it every 3 years. They kind of messed up the calculation. And then I think a few decades later, they were looking at the stars and realized, oh, I think we missed this by a year. So they made a small correction to make it every 4 years. But, to figure out how the calendar works, 2000 years ago, come on, it's incredible.
I can't even wrap my head around that. That's I can barely do basic math, and they're correcting for leap years, thousands of years ago. I think it really just is a testament to the intelligence of the ancient world. So we have the Julian calendar, the addressing of debt and economic disparity. So Caesar's economic reforms were broad and aimed at addressing the immediate needs of the populace while laying the groundwork for long-term stability. I can really appreciate how he is always focused on addressing the needs of today, but kind of future-proofing them to make sure that there is some long-term stability and longevity in what he's doing. And I think we see this throughout the entirety of his life story up to this point. But he's able to implement measures to alleviate debt. He restructured the tax system to be more equitable. He initiates massive public work projects to employ and support Rome's lower classes. Again, actions designed to not only stabilize the economy, but also cement his popularity among the populace.
Well, he's dictator for life, right? So he's got time, right? He's thinking long term. He's declared himself dictator for life. And yeah, he's doing some really great things because not a lot's been done for the last couple decades just with all the chaos that's been going on. So there's some well-needed reforms that need to come in, but he's a dictator. What does he need to worry about what the Senate thinks? He just needs the people on his side and he needs the army on his side. And again, talk about foreshadowing, right? What does he need the Senate for? But part of this too that I think we need to talk about is, he's doing all these great things. The people are really happy. Sure, the Senate's not happy with him, but how do we get to the point where they're looking to actually assassinate him? Part of the things that we're starting to see with Caesar is he's not a king by name, but he's doing very kingly things. He's, there's a story where all the senators came in and he didn't stand up, which is very customary for Romans that, we're all equals. We all stand up. And, it may have been a misunderstanding. He claimed he was sick that day, so he wasn't able to stand up. And Caesar having epilepsy was actually quite well known. He was always suffering with seizures and his health was not in good state for most of his life. It was totally possible, but the optics, right, of you didn't get up for your fellow senators. There's rumors of statues of Caesar, people putting crowns on it, and yes. Mark Antony kind of had some role in that of kind of hyping Caesar up. And so there's all these things where Caesar's not fully coming out saying, knock it off, I'm not a king, I'm just in power, like Sulla was, to kind of get things back on track, and then we're going to go back to the way things are supposed to be. But he's not promoting it saying, put the crown on my head, I'm a king, as he's being accused. He's towing this line in the middle, but I think he's not, the senators are looking at this and going, he's not fully denying it. If he wasn't trying to be a king, he would just come out and deny it. But on the other hand, there's so many people doing all of these things saying, hey, you're a king, you're great. And he's like, oh, hey, you guys, knock it off. But, with kind of a little tongue in cheek. So you can see how the senators are starting to look at this going, dictator for life. You're going to relinquish power. We see another Roman king. And as we talked about at the beginning of the last episode, Romans do not want a king. That's the whole basis of the Republic, was overthrowing the king. And it's not looking good for Caesar from that perspective, at least on the way the Senate's looking at him. But from his perspective, the people love him. The army loves him. What has he got to lose at this point?
It's such an interesting juxtaposition, right? Like, he is obviously very popular with the populace, and he's done so in a very pragmatic and strategic way. But there is a much darker, murkier backdrop against this because, he's not king in name, but he may be king by action, or at least in action, if he's not willing to behold or hold up to, those customary traditions that the Republic is kind of, standing up on. And I think there's this growing divide, right? There is a rift that has existed and continues to grow. And this is where the conspiracy starts to take root.
Yeah, I think when we talk about this conspiracy, right, it's no run-of-the-mill conspiracy of just, hey, let's try to overthrow, some leader or some guy. Like, this is when we talk about famous assassinations.
Yes.
I don't think anybody's, higher up on the list, maybe Franz Ferdinand, and just because of the kicking off of World War I. But again, to add to the romantic element of this, and, Shakespeare has a huge role in all of this. This is the one, right? This is the big assassination that, when we go back in history and we look at, famous events, this one's always kind of top of the list. And again, it has that romantic element to it, but there is some interesting pieces here on how it all goes down and then what the actual aftermath is, which I think is even more fascinating than the assassination itself.
Yeah, so maybe we'll talk a little bit about the actual roots of the conspiracy, because I think it's very important. So amidst the backdrop of this kind of suspicion and rift, this conspiracy begins to take root. It's led by Gaius Cassius Longus and Brutus. So both men who were senators of noble lineage. They're deeply invested in the ideals of the Republic, and they're increasingly alarmed by Caesar's accumulation of power. Brutus in particular represented a bit of a poignant figure in this drama, with a personal history intertwined with, Caesar and a lineage that tracked back to Brutus, the founder of the Roman Republic. His involvement gave this kind of sense of legitimacy to the conspirators' cause. And I think it's probably worthwhile to note, did the conspirators see themselves, as potential murderers or liberators? And I think that's always an interesting contention with this type of kind of dramatic, event that we're about to see. Their aim in their mind, I would venture to guess that they're seeing themselves as aiming to preserve the Republic's ideals by removing what they perceive as its greatest threat, Caesar himself. So this group, which eventually, numbered in the dozens, was united by this shared belief in the Republic's restoration and the conviction that Caesar's death was the only path to achieve it.
Yeah, you can definitely see there's some idealist elements to this of this like from the vibe I get from Cassius and Brutus is this isn't hey, we want ultimate power here. Because they're not great military leaders in the same way Caesar is or Pompey was. They know they're not going to be able to consolidate this new empire or new republic, whatever you want to call it, into this, whatever they want it to be, because they don't have that military strength. They're doing it from a purely idealistic standpoint, but they really, really miss what's really going on there. There's much more around Caesar than just the man himself. He's really started this movement and he has so many people loyal to him. So to be able to pull this off, they not only have to kill Caesar, but you probably got to kill Mark Antony. You probably got to kill Octavian, and you got to really find a way to consolidate your power, because there's no way that you're just going to kill Caesar and wake up tomorrow and everyone's like, all right, well, who's the next man up? And we're back to, being a republic, right? And that's kind of what they did, right? They really didn't have a plan. They execute Caesar on the Ides of March in this very, romantic way as the story kind of goes. But they didn't have a plan. The next day, they're like, Mark Antony, you're in charge. He's like, what? I'm sorry, what? I'm in charge? He actually leaves Rome thinking that he's going to be executed. because he's part of this, and he comes back and they put him in power. Like, it's really weird. They really didn't have a plan. And we'll talk about Octavian and eventually who becomes Augustus in a few episodes and how he kind of takes matters into his own hands. But this is almost what happens when just pure politicians who don't really understand, who are kind of living in their ivory tower, part of these great families who have been around for forever, are taking matters into their own hands. Like, you need that little bit of brute force to be able to kind of, this is a coup essentially, right? To do everything they're trying to do. This, if you've seen the movie where they actually try to assassinate Adolf Hitler, the whole plan around that isn't just so much killing him. It's, well, what do we do with all the people that are loyal to him? How do we get the army under control? How do we control the country? They don't really do any of that. They're kind of just doing it for to me seems like idealistic purposes. And, they see him as this figure of ending the republic. If we get rid of him, everything will go back to normal, which is a massive miscalculation on their side.
It's a very short-sighted decision, right? Like, after the Ides of March, the stabbing that occurs, and, Rome is kind of plunged into this uncertainty and chaos. And to your point about Mark Antony, he's a loyal supporter and seasoned political operator. Why would he assume that, with his alliance to Caesar, that he would be next in line, given that he was just murdered? And I think it really goes to show the short-sightedness and lack of kind of, the broader picture outside of this ideal vision that they're hoping to kind of, realize after the fact. It just doesn't happen that way.
Yeah, they almost had this, like, again, we're romanticizing this story. They're romanticizing the good old days. And if we just got rid of this Caesar guy, we're going to be back to the way things were before, and everything's going to be wonderful. And, they probably don't understand their history, that there's been 100 years of leading up to this, and you really don't understand the political arena that's around you. But, I think it was up to 60 senators were in on the conspiracy. So,
yeah, it was 60.
He did enough to really annoy a lot of senators, but you'd think one or two of them would have said, hey, like, what are we doing here? But maybe they just had kind of other visions of how things would kind of come together. But yeah, it's a very, very odd way of going about it. But hey, it makes for an interesting story. And to be honest, it allows Augustus to become, who he ends up becoming. So, and in the end, it works out very well for Rome in that context, but boy, does it change things for the better, depending on, I guess, how you look at the Roman Republic versus the Roman Empire.
Yeah, and I think definitely to be discussed further in future episodes at length. I know we're at the hour mark, but I think, to your point, Paul, I'm not going to say it's a timely or an untimely end. I think it's a messy end. And it triggers, the shift from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. I don't know how much gravitas it holds for Caesar's legacy. I think it is a very dramatic, painful way to go out, but it also shows this kind of double-edged sword that was his life and was his legacy at the end of the day.
It's an inevitable end, I think, for him, based on how many enemies he created without his life and how close he was to death so many times. The only thing I find interesting is the timing of it. He's won this civil war. He's consolidated his power, but he kind of, I don't know if he allows this to happen or maybe puts too much trust in the Senate around him for it to happen. And I find it interesting because, like, this should have been how he died. Like, it makes sense. But when you take everything into account and you see how he actually died, this is probably one of the most kind of peaceful times for Caesar. You would have thought he would be able to actually enjoy seep the rewards of what he's done. Unfortunately, it really doesn't work that way. Oh, and one other thing too, we have to talk about Et tu, Brute, the famous kind of scene line.
Of course, yeah.
Without surprise, obviously, he never said that. I don't think he said anything. Most historians say that guy got stabbed a bunch of times. He's not letting off little poetic lines, right? This was obviously something that was added years later, and to make it kind of more of a, fantasy kind of story and make things a bit more interesting. But, he's being stabbed with no armor in the middle of a Senate meeting. So he's not really, probably doesn't have the, the oxygen in his lungs to even say anything, let alone think about what he's going to say. So obviously I never said that, but yeah, a fitting end, unfortunately, and an inevitable end, but just kind of weird, I think, from a timing perspective.
Yeah. The timing, I think that's such a great point. The timing seems very odd given where he's at this point in time and where the Republic's at. But again, I think when you're motivated by ideals, you don't necessarily operate in the most pragmatic way or strategic way. I think you're motivated by something that you hope materializes, but clearly, it wasn't very well planned for the immediate aftermath or future.
Yeah, it's a very it's an amateur job, unfortunately. Like they got part 1 done, but that's honestly the easy part. Actually doing the assassination, it's kind of how you bring everything together. So with that being said, we have much more of this story to continue on with. So next time we're going to be talking about Cleopatra. So we didn't really get into her life today too much for reasons of she needs her own episode, and there's a lot more that happens in her life when it comes to pre-Caesar and Pompey arriving. But then after they leave and the second civil war that happens in Rome, she also plays a key role into that. And then we'll follow that up with talking about Octavian, who becomes Augustus, who kind of wraps this whole story up and really pushes Rome into becoming an empire and has an extraordinary life in his own regard and is considered by everybody as Rome's greatest emperor. So there's a few more interesting characters and people to talk about within this story and within this ancient world. So stay tuned for that over the next couple of weeks. And we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.